The US and Russia are often compared as the world's top military powers, but let's be honest, Russia's military is falling apart. After 2.5 years of struggling in Ukraine, Russia's once feared force looks more like a relic of the past. So let's get to it. Does Russia even stand a chance against the US military? With outdated tanks blowing up left and right and poorly trained conscripts barely making it to the front lines, it's not looking good for Moscow. In this video, we'll show you why US air superiority is unmatched while Russia's jets and drones struggle to stay relevant, how the US tanks dominate the battlefield and Russian models crumble under fire, and why the US Navy's fleet dwarfs Russia's single broken aircraft carrier. Stay tuned as we break down why Russia's military is barely holding on and why the US remains the undisputed global power. Before we dive into tanks, jets, and ships, let's start with the basics: manpower. Numbers don't tell the whole story, but they reveal a lot about each country's readiness. A spoiler, it's not just about how many soldiers they have. Let's break it down. On one side, we have the US with roughly 1.3 million active military personnel and about 2.8 million total, including the National Guard and Reserve, according to statistics from the Department of Defense. Similarly, the website Global Firepower lists Russia's current active military personnel at roughly 1.3 million. However, other sources suggest that the actual count is much lower, at about 1 million in total. The discrepancy in numbers can be explained by Russia's involvement in an ongoing war, where troop counts are often inconsistent, especially due to the recent military campaigns in Kursk and Donbass. But let's take a look at some other population metrics to determine how exactly Russia and the US can get new soldiers. For example, total population numbers suggest that the US has a clear advantage. With roughly 330 million people in the US against some 140 million on Russia's side, the US simply has a larger pool of military-aged men and volunteer women to pull from if needed. These numbers are further supported by Global Firepower's estimates of how many men reach military age each year. For the US, the number is estimated to be as high as 4.4 million, compared to Russia's mere 1.2 million. However, pure population numbers aren't quite meaningful if people are not actually signing up for military service. And that's where we see the first major ideological difference between these two countries. On one side, the US military uses purely the volunteer or contract service model. That means that all recruits that go to the army have willingly signed up for military service. Based on statistics from the Department of Defense, there are roughly 150,000 recruits going through the US military's Basic Combat Training, Boot Camp or BTC. The DoD also suggests that there were roughly 200,000 applicants for BTC in the previous year, meaning that a majority of applicants were accepted into BTC. Out of those, it's suggested that roughly 80 to 90% actually pass BCT and become US military soldiers and go on to advanced training. However, the Department of Defense also suggests that 150,000 recruits each year is not enough to satisfy each of the branch's quotas. The DoD reports that the Army has shrunk by about 15% active members in the past decade, alongside most other branches of the military, while the Navy was the only one to see growth, at roughly 8% since 2011. Accordingly, it's estimated that the military frequently misses its recruitment targets by 10 to 15% per year, which is caused by lower application numbers, overall lower interest in serving in the Army, and young adults being unable to pass the health assessments to get into BCT. Despite those setbacks in acquiring new personnel, the US military remains one of the largest in the world. Based on 2024, it's only behind India and China, which have over 2 million active members, but also have a population 4 times larger than the US. In the other corner, we have Russia, which uses a dual mandatory conscription plus contract soldier system. According to data published by the Russian Ministry of Defense, Russia is currently conscripting 150,000 soldiers every 6 months. Additionally, data from 2023 suggests that the Russian military signed roughly 490,000 military contracts for soldiers during that year. But that number is incredibly misleading. You see, during the war with Ukraine, the Russian military has lowered the minimum duration of a contract to as little as 6 months, which is aimed particularly at convicts and conscripts who are nearing the end of their mandatory military service. According to a report by Riddle, more than half of those contracts are either renewed contracts through the year or deaths being covered up by the Russian army in Ukraine. Riddle assumes that the actual number of new contracted soldiers during 2023 could be as low as 200,000. That still leaves Russia with quite a bit more growth than the US overall. And that's where the current war also comes in, to throw yet another wrench in Russia's numbers. According to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, Russia has suffered roughly 650,000 military casualties throughout the 31 months of warfare. Additionally, the rate at which Russia has been accumulating these casualties has only risen in the past few months. It's estimated that Russia has been losing roughly 1,000 soldiers per day since the beginning of 2024. In more recent months, however, that figure has jumped to 1,300 soldiers per day. According to those numbers, Russia barely has more soldiers coming into its military than it's been losing in the war. Some analysts suggest that if the war goes on for another year, Russia is well on track to suffer 1 million casualties by mid-2025. There are also two other vital matters to discuss when it comes to troops: military training and contract durations. In the US, soldiers receive 10 weeks of basic training, followed by anywhere from 4 to 10 months of advanced individual training. Alternatively, officer academy tracks can last for another few years. After being recruited into the military, soldiers typically sign a 4-year contract with an option to renew it for another 4 years afterward. Russia has a wholly different system, largely due to its dual recruitment model. Both conscripts and new contract soldiers typically receive at least 9 weeks of basic combat training, followed by anywhere between 3 to 6 months of individual training. However, mandatory military service lasts for a single year, while military contracts last for 2 years. All soldiers have the option to renew their military contracts, typically for up to 8 total years of military service. These factors are further complicated by the fact that the US and Russia conduct their basic training slightly differently. The US houses all recruits in 5 training centers across the country, ensuring that all new soldiers receive the same baseline training across their generation. On the other hand, Russian basic training heavily differs between one unit and the next, as it's up to each unit to conduct training methods and ensure their conscripts are trained. Add to that the Russian conscripts are generally considered second-class soldiers, since they won't be in the military for as long as contracted ones, and also are legally not allowed to be deployed abroad, and basic training can heavily differ between these two troop types. Since units typically have a mix of conscripts and contract soldiers, Russian training officers have a much harder time getting all their recruits trained up to be ready for regular military duties. Additionally, the rate at which the Russian army is losing soldiers also means that recruits are likely going through much shorter and more basic training regimes. According to an interview with a prisoner of war captured in the Kursk region, some conscripts are getting as little as 1 or 2 weeks of basic training before they are put on defensive posts. Finally, the state of the war has likely deteriorated the morale of the average Russian soldier. While the army is trying to get as many conscripts as possible by offering salaries in the range of triple or quadruple the national averages, chances are many contract soldiers either end up dying or leaving the army when their first contract ends. Considering the high turnaround of Russian soldiers, it's highly unlikely that the Russian officers can maintain a satisfactory level of training across all its units. This isn't even a particularly new problem either. A 2023 report by the Center for Naval Analyses, the CNA, suggests that 2016 saw high-ranking naval fleet officers dismissed for serious omissions in the organization of combat preparation and distortions of the real state of affairs in reports to the defense minister. In other words, high-ranking officers have been skirting the rules for training their recruits for practically a decade now, and they have misrepresented actual combat readiness to the higher echelons of the Russian military. When you combine all these extenuating factors, it's clear that the Russian troops are likely nowhere near the level of the US troops. But it's not just the Russian troops themselves that are heavily outmatched. Let's discuss some of the key military equipment and vehicles that the two countries have at their disposal. We'll start with land vehicles, since Russia's have actually been the reason the country really couldn't do much with its troops in Ukraine. According to Global Firepower, Russia has over 14,000 tanks at its disposal, while the US military is estimated to have between 4,600 and 5,400. These numbers are not particularly useful for determining the exact vehicles, and Russia's numbers fluctuate greatly depending on the source used for the information. So let's see exactly what the countries are working with. The main battle tank of the US military is the M1 Abrams, specifically the M1A1 and M1A2 models. These can be considered current tanks, even though the first Abrams entered service back in 1980. Technically, the Abrams tanks slot into the upgraded third-generation category, which is currently the gold standard in militaries across the world. The upgrades typically include better optics and more technology improvements, such as communications and guidance systems. On Russia's side, the equivalent tank would be the T-90, or more specifically the T-90M. A side-by-side comparison between the M1A2 Abrams and the T-90M shows that they are pretty evenly matched, at least on paper. For example, the Abrams is considered more maneuverable, with a slightly higher top speed, but the T-90M's lower overall weight allows it to pick up speed and change directions faster. When comparing the tank's offensive capabilities, both seem to have similar power to mow down infantry as well as take down enemy tanks. The more advanced ammunition of the Abrams is considered to be slightly better than the T-90's equivalent. However, the T-90M possesses the ability to store anti-tank guided missiles, which the Abrams tank does not utilize, giving them a theoretical advantage in mid to long-range warfare. Ultimately, it's the defensive capabilities of these tanks that matter in the long run, as evidenced by how the tanks are performing in the war in Ukraine. One of the greatest downsides of the T-90, and indeed the entire T-tank line that came before it, comes in the tank's autoloader. In this system, the tank's additional ammunition is not stored inside the tank, but rather separately below the turret. The ammo stockpile is protected by a relatively thin layer of armor, although the newest T-90M upgrade has slightly increased its anti-tank missile defenses. Regardless of the upgrade, the actual danger to the tank comes from missiles and drones that can target the ammo stockpile directly, typically from below. For example, a drone or a missile can puncture the armor, detonating the spare ammo and completely obliterating the entire tank. This strategy has been utilized by the Ukrainian military to take out T-type tanks en masse, with the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense reporting over 8,800 Russian tanks destroyed over the course of 31 months. The Abrams uses a manual loading system that doesn't have this flaw, making it an all-round safer vehicle for its passengers. Additionally, it should be noted that while the US primarily has stockpiles of various versions of Abrams tanks, with 500 M1A1s and 2,100 M1A2s on active duty, with an estimated reserve of 3,000 tanks, Russia only has 150 T-90s in total. The rest of Russia's tanks are T-80s, T-72s, and even some T-62s. Reports from 2023 suggested that Russia was also shipping T-52s and T-54s to the Ukrainian front, possibly in an attempt to gain some time to replenish its supplies of more modern vehicles. With all this in mind, it's safe to say that the US Abrams tanks can outcompete the Russian tank arsenal purely due to more advanced technology, considering that the current generation tanks from the US heavily outnumber their Russian counterparts. It's not only the tanks that matter in land warfare. Infantry support and armored fighting vehicles are another vital aspect of land mobility and mechanized infantry squads. On the American side, we see 11,500 M113 Armored Personnel Carriers (APCs), 4,200 M2 Bradleys, 2,000 M3 Bradleys, over 5,400 M-ATVs, and 4,000 M1120 Strykers. The Russian side predominantly has BMPs, 7,500 BMP-1s and 3,900 BMP-2s, as well as some BMP-3s, as well as Soviet-era MT-LBs. Of those, the Bradleys, Strykers, and BMPs could be considered the closest analogues to each other. But how do they compare? Well, NATO has donated some Bradleys to Ukraine, so we can use direct reports from the battlefield. The main differences between the American Bradleys and the Russian BMPs lie in what they try to achieve. Bradleys are highly maneuverable vehicles that are designed to bolster infantry counteroffensives. On the other hand, BMPs are designed to be a jack-of-all-trades in infantry support vehicles, meaning they should theoretically be able to handle any given scenario. And yet the number of these vehicles Russia has lost comes to around 4,680 from a report in mid-2023, no less. On the other hand, Ukraine has lost only 68 Bradleys at that point, but it should be noted that Ukraine had a much lower supply of these vehicles to begin with. But perhaps the true power in the US support vehicles comes with the M1120 Strykers. Dubbed the incredibly versatile Strykers, these are one of the few 8-wheeled vehicles used in the US military, with their highlight being sheer adaptability. Strykers can be equipped with an incredible array of technology and gear, allowing the US military to create the perfect answer to whatever the enemy forces can throw their way. Strykers have been used as missile carriers, support vehicles, medical transport, engineer squad vehicles, mobile command units, mortar carriers, and even biological, chemical, and nuclear warfare support. To that end, it's not surprising that the US would have an overwhelming advantage on the ground, at least as far as vehicles are concerned. But a fight between the US and Russia would likely start with long-range artillery and air-to-air combat. So let's compare some of these aspects of each country's military. First up, it's the artillery potential of both countries. On paper, Russia has a definitive numerical advantage, with roughly 6,200 pieces of self-propelled artillery, compared to the US having 1,600, as well as over 8,300 pieces of towed artillery, compared to the US's 1,200. In fact, Russia is widely considered to have the largest artillery arsenal in the world. But again, it's not just about pure numbers. However, what Russia has managed to do falls nothing short of a miracle for an economy of its size. While Russia still uses some of the oldest Soviet-era self-propelled artillery models with minor technological upgrades, the country's reliance on quantity over quality is definitely paying off. NATO intelligence suggests that not only does Russia have an overwhelming advantage when it comes to artillery vehicles and guns, but the country is also outproducing both the US and Europe. NATO estimates that Russia produces as many as 3 million artillery shells per year, while the US and Europe have been sending only about 1.2 million to Ukraine, so as to not diminish their own supplies. Russia's use of relatively old artillery pieces is one of the few aspects where focusing on quantity over quality gives it an advantage. For example, one of the more modern weapons, the M109A6, has a fire rate of 1 round every 3 minutes. Its upgrade, the M109A7, uses an autoloader to drive the firing rate up to 1 a minute, or achieve a burst of 4 rounds in a minute. By comparison, some of Russia's oldest models, the 2S3s, fire 2 to 3 rounds per minute with manual reloading. And Russia wasn't slacking on improving its artillery. The 2S19 can fire at a rate between 5 and 7 rounds per minute, easily outstripping the M109s. More recent variants of the 2S line include the GLONASS-powered targeting system and an improved firing rate with autoloading. Some strategists have suggested that the war in Ukraine is largely a stalemate due to Russia being able to abuse its artillery advantage. Considering that the US also has a smaller artillery arsenal and doesn't produce as many shells per month, long-range artillery strikes between the countries would end up in Russia's favor if there weren't any extenuating factors. Luckily for the US, those extenuating factors are its air force, drones, and more advanced long-range missile arsenals. According to the US Air Force statistics, the country has access to 5,500 military airplanes across various functions and models. Perhaps the most obvious is the country's fleet of roughly 2,900 fighter and multi-role jets, with the oldest models being the lauded F-15s and F-16s, the latter of which has been making waves in Ukraine as the most modern jet in the country. On the other side is Russia, with an air fleet of 809 fighter and multi-role jets. The most obvious comparisons can be made between the F-16s, of which the US has roughly 880, and Russia's Sukhoi Su-34s, numbering around 125. According to a report by National Interest, the Su-34s are more of an analog to the F-15E, but the jet's upgraded missile system and radar can allow it to contest F-16s in both mid- and close combat scenarios. In simulated fights, both planes typically match up evenly, resulting in mutual destruction. However, the F-16s are not generally used as air-to-air superiority aircraft, being primarily designed to carry air-to-surface missiles instead. The Su-35s, meanwhile, are more dedicated flanker-type aircraft with an armament of cruise missiles. But the comparison starts going in favor of the US Air Force by virtue of F-22s and F-35s, both much more modernized and upgraded versions of the F-15s and 16s. If you compare those models against the Su-35s, the Russian aircraft will be at a definitive disadvantage. Furthermore, the US has roughly 550 F-35s in various designs and 185 F-22s, which means they've got Russia's most modern aircraft heavily outnumbered. The sheer scale at which the US Air Force could dominate the sky over Russia would also allow the US aircraft to be used more offensively. These include the country's arsenal of over 150 bombers compared to Russia's 120. A theoretical scenario where both countries approach combat with air superiority in mind would likely see Russia's key military facilities bombed from the air, while the US Air Force keeps the sky clear of Russian defenders. The second vital aircraft category is helicopters, where the US leads once again with roughly 5,700 compared to Russia's 1,600. This will give the US military more opportunity to shuttle troops around and open more fronts where the Russians will be forced to defend themselves. The US Air Force also has a higher operational capacity when it comes to training its pilots. The country uses over 2,600 trainer aircraft compared to Russia's 550. This allows US troops to be more experienced with modern combat tactics, as well as work with aircraft that have lower flight hours logged, which means that the US is not putting as much wear and tear on its aircraft to deliver a steady stream of experienced personnel to the front lines. All these factors mean that the US Air Force rightfully takes first place in the world. But modern air combat isn't only decided by manned aircraft. Unmanned combat aerial vehicles, also known as UCAVs, or drones, are likely going to be the defining factors of future wars between modern countries, if they even get there. In some capacities, drones have seen extensive use in the war in Ukraine. However, most of these drones were repurposed commercial drones with ordnance strapped onto them, rather than dedicated military drones that the US and Russia could possibly use. Of course, Ukraine has been building up its local UCAV industry as well, but the more common makeshift drones are a big part of how the country has been able to repel Russia's tanks and artillery for so long. Going back to the US and Russian drones though, we once again see a clear advantage for the US due to the country having some of the most advanced models in the world. The clear leader is the General Atomics MQ-9 Reaper, of which the US Air Force is estimated to have over 289 as of 2021. Each of these drones costs a staggering $32 million. Unlike kamikaze drones that are being used in Ukraine or recon and intelligence-gathering drones that were seen before, the MQ-9 Reaper, sometimes dubbed the Predator B, is a multi-purpose hunter-killer drone. The drone has a range of over 1,000 miles, can stay in the air for up to 14 hours when fully loaded, or over 40 hours with a partial load and added fuel tanks, and carries up to 3,000 pounds of missiles, which can be a combination of air-to-surface or air-to-air ordnance depending on the mission at hand. The only Russian counterpart to the Predator is the Kronstadt Orion, of which Russia has 48 but has barely used during its offensive missions in Ukraine. A big part of that is the fact that Ukraine has quickly adopted layered anti-air defenses, which drastically reduce the drone's survivability. The cheaper and more numerous converted commercial drones are much more disposable for both countries involved. Regardless, the US has a much higher ceiling when it comes to drone warfare, and the country's enormous budget means that it can rapidly adopt the same drone-based style seen in Ukraine and put it to good use. Additionally, the US Air Force is supported by a fleet of aircraft carriers more numerous than the rest of the world combined. The US Navy operates a staggering 11 aircraft carriers, 10 Nimitz-class and the more modern USS Gerald R. Ford-class carrier, with an additional order of 4 more Ford-class carriers on the way. By comparison, Russia only has one carrier, which hasn't even been operational for 6 years as it's undergoing repairs and upgrades that keep getting pushed back. This allows the US military to create significant pressure on its adversary by approaching its targets from the sea and cutting off vital trade routes that could practically isolate countries that rely on naval trade, such as China. The USS Ford is considered the pinnacle of modern aircraft carrier design, and China's attempts to make a comparable model seem to have failed miserably so far. Additionally, the US Navy commands 75 destroyer-class ships, while Russia has only 14. These ships are vital in projecting naval power and clearing out enemy ships and submarines, so the US has a clear edge in operational capacity. The Russian Navy is also more scattered, with Arctic, Baltic, and Black Sea fleets. The distance between these fleets makes each of them less of a threat. Furthermore, 2 of those fleets, the Baltic and the Black Sea, are practically fenced in by NATO countries, making them far less potent. Of course, it bears mentioning how both countries are funding their militaries, as that can indicate their long-term growth potential. The US is by far the biggest spender, providing more funds for its military than the next 10 national militaries combined. Its military budget for 2024 is roughly $831 billion, compared to $109 billion that the Russian government sequestered for its military. The numbers start to look even starker for Russia when you realize that the US only uses about 3.4% of its GDP on military, while Russia's military spending for 2024 is projected to be approximately 7.1% of its GDP. And recent reports even indicate that military spending will account for up to 35% of total government spending this year. This means that if push comes to shove, the US probably has more funds to inject into its military than Russia does. Add to the fact that the Russian economy has been battered by international sanctions for over 2 years, and the country's vital oil refineries being taken out by Ukraine, and Russia's economy is unlikely to be able to support this level of military spending for the long haul while still being in active war. All these aspects point to the US having an overwhelming military advantage across most fields of war. However, these only really make a big impact if the countries end up in conflict against nations or coalitions that don't have nuclear weapons. Both the US and Russia have roughly the same number of nuclear warheads, 5,400 total warheads and around 1,700 deployed ones. Why does this matter? Russia's nuclear weapons policy, although defensive, is also pretty trigger-happy. Under President Vladimir Putin and his new proposed rules, Russia states it has the right to launch nuclear weapons as soon as a nuclear-capable country starts directly working against Russia's interests. And one of those interests has so far been its special military operation in Ukraine. Therefore, in a hypothetical scenario where the US and Russia actually go to war against one another, there's a remote but non-zero possibility that Russia would opt for mutually assured destruction via nuclear warfare. And the consequences of this war would be catastrophic for pretty much everyone involved, directly or indirectly. A simulation by the Future of Life Institute shows that no matter which country fires the first shot, the other one can reciprocate by at most a 10-minute delay. Considering the sheer number of available nuclear warheads, some of which are hydrogen rather than atomic bombs, it's likely that most of the northern hemisphere gets bombed back into the Stone Age. The resulting explosions would create a huge cloud of nuclear fallout that will block out the sun over the hemisphere, causing temperature drops of 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Mass agriculture would become little more than a pipe dream. The simulations also estimate 5 billion, that's billion with a B, casualties from explosions, radiation exposure, and widespread famine. So where does that leave us? The US reigns supreme as the world's best and most technologically advanced military in the world. Russia is somewhere around the top 5, but its precise ranking is pretty much impossible to determine, considering the sheer losses it accrued over the past 31 months of war. Additionally, Russia has put significant effort into rebuilding its military, so it's uncertain how that will scale into a long-term military presence. In the end, the two countries are unlikely to engage in meaningful and direct war against one another, as the threat of the use of nuclear weapons is too high to ignore, so long as Putin is in charge of Russia. But what do you think? Has Russia fallen below the top 5 spots? And is there a country that can give the US military a run for its money? Thank you for watching, and leave your comments below.